Hey everyone, the Coop here. It occurred to me the other day that I've got a few different video essays that are in the works, and I'm kind of entering now into the realm of games criticism, and I thought that it might make sense for me to give you guys some idea of the theory that I bring behind both the way that I criticize games and the way that I criticize the balance of games. So there's going to be two videos here. Part one is going to be talking about my view of games criticism, and part two is going to be talking about my view of game balance. These aren't necessarily to persuade you that my opinions on these things are right, but just to explain to you how I think about these things, so when you watch my reviews or you listen to my criticisms of games, that you have a bit of an understanding of the frameworks that I bring. There's no real good way of talking about games journalism right now without taking some shots at existing games journalism. If you're like me, you grew up with, IGN, PC Gamer, or Giant Bomb, or some kind of large publication generally being the place that you went to look for good criticism of games. I remember for me specifically, I literally used to subscribe to the paper magazine for PC Gamer, and I looked forward to getting it every month because it was generally like at least it felt to me like a very in-touch connection with the PC gaming community. And obviously, over the years, that has significantly changed the way that the internet currently works. These companies, these corporations that own these games criticism pages are about pushing as much content in a very specific manufactured package that you don't really get authentic kind of gamer community centered criticism of these games. A perfect example that I think Dunkey uses in his commentary on games criticism is that one of the major flaws of these big publications is that they have a revolving door of writers and reviewers. And often these writers and reviewers are actually really good. But there's this whole problem of them being these giant corporations who are asking these often very talented writers to write very specific, very calculated kinds of reviews. And often the personality and the personal insight that a lot of these writers bring just doesn't come through in the reviews that they end up submitting. For me, one of the most important things when it comes to criticizing games in general is to have a consistent critical voice. I know, for example, that if Dunkey rates a JRPG very highly, that it's a very good JRPG. I know that there's a whole host of JRPGs that Dunkey will not appreciate that I will likely appreciate. But when he rates one highly and I'm not paying attention to it, that really means that it's a game that I need to pay attention to. So knowing his biases, his tendencies, is an extremely important part of using his critical perspective for my own benefit. That's one of the reasons I wanted to make this video, is that I want you to understand me better as a critic so that you can use my criticism as a way of gauging whether you will actually enjoy a game or not. The one really major thing that I want to bring to my criticism that I feel a lot of critics don't bring is talking about the communities that surround games. Often, especially in IGN style criticism, you'll get what I would call overly technical criticism. So they hyper focus on things like the graphics, the engine, how many polygons there are, what kind of AI gets used, those sort of really technical production level things. Because they're overly focused on the technical elements of games, they often miss a lot of what games bring as art. There's not a lot of conversation about how the art of the video game resonates with the reviewer. There's not a lot of discussion of the actual game design principles that are being used in the game and how they're used to specific kinds of artistic effect. Like a specific example that comes to mind for me is the lack of quest markers and the lack of quest guides in Elden Ring. On one hand, and from a very technological, very industry standard perspective, you could look at the lack of quest trackers as a shortcoming. You are making it harder for the gamer to keep track of their quests. On the other hand, we can see that this lends itself to a sense of mystery and discovery. And this lack of quest tracking is actually a feature that has been in all of the Dark Souls games. And while at times is frustrating, significantly contributes to the atmosphere around those quests. So that would be a good example of holding two parts of the criticism in tension with each other. And I don't feel like modern games journalism is able to really do that. They tend to just look at the technical side, which is this makes it difficult for players, and leave it at that. Not what is the additional, what do we actually get from making that different decision? There's a certain kind of complaint that happens often when talking about games criticism. You're being nitpicking, you are complaining, you're being overly critical. And these kind of comments generally come from people who have specifically good experience with a game. So a good question is, why do we criticize games that are good? Games criticism, in my opinion, is inherently worthwhile because it's super important for it's super important for people who consume media to think critically about the media that they consume, both in a technical sense and in an artistic sense. The job of a critic, in my opinion, is to help people who don't have the time or energy to maybe go down all of the rabbit holes and think super critically about every single element of a game, and bring that criticism into conversation to help people think of different kinds of criticisms for themselves, and also just enjoy the process of analyzing a piece of art. This process can also sometimes help people see why a game is particularly good when on the surface it looks like it may not be. And it might help others who see certain flaws in a game to see why the flaws are actually part of what makes the game so good. Really, at the end of the day, criticism is about a deeper level of understanding of the thing that we're talking about. So that's my goal when I am doing games criticism on this channel, is to, through criticism, offer a deeper and more rich understanding of the games that we're playing. If I just despise a game and I think there's no value in analyzing it, you probably won't see me making a video on it on my channel. If I'm criticizing a game, to me, it means that there's a bare minimum amount of good kind of artistic value to it, that it's worth mining into the details to find out more and think a little bit more deeply about it. So my hope isn't to be completely unbiased and to offer you some sort of objective criticism of these games. My hope is that by watching these videos that I make, that you can have an understanding of the biases that I bring to the table, and I'll try to highlight my own biases as much as possible so that you can see where you and I disagree, and you can use my criticism as a jumping off point to your own deep engagement with art. One element of games criticism that I hope I can really bring to the table is the way that games resonate with the communities that have centered around them. This is an element that I don't often see talked about in games criticism, which is that games always draw a certain kind of community to surround them. And I think a really important part of games criticism is taking into consideration the way that the community around a game uses the game. A great example for me is like the transmogging community in Final Fantasy XIV, or the role-playing community in Fantasy XIV, or a whole bunch of other things, or the lore heads in Elden Ring. There's a lot of different examples of these kind of different ways that people really enjoy specific games. And I think it's important to talk about those different ways that people enjoy the game when criticizing the game, because then the game design decisions impact those different people differently. On my channel, I am going to be using a numbered system. I'm going to be rating games out of 10 because it's kind of a thing to do. And one of the things that I wanted to cover here is how I use those numbers and what to expect when I'm rating things by number. To me, a 10 out of 10 is not a perfect game. There is no such thing as a flawless game. Every game has its flaws, its benefits, and drawbacks. What a 10 out of 10 is for me is a masterpiece in its own right. A great example of this for me is Breath of the Wild. While Breath of the Wild has tons of flaws that I could really get into at length here, Breath of the Wild is an example of a game that does what it wants to super effectively, both in terms of storytelling and especially in terms of open world design and mechanics. The traveling in Breath of the Wild is revolutionary. Personally, as a game critic, I don't know how to engage with the open world genre without referencing back to Breath of the Wild now. Breath of the Wild was such a fun experience for me. The movement in the open world was like nothing I've ever experienced before. And every time I think about the open world genre, I constantly go back to, how does this compare to Breath of the Wild? And that happens automatically for me. So to me, that is something that defines a 10 out of 10 game. Another example of a 10 out of 10 game for me is Dark Souls 1. Whether you agree or not, I believe that Dark Souls 1 has fundamentally changed the gaming industry as we know it. Every single player experience now is drawing on or referencing in some way Dark Souls 1, whether it's level design, difficulty, mechanics. There are so many ways that things are referencing Dark Souls 1 right now. So for me, a 10 out of 10 is not just a really good game, a game that stands out as a perfect example of its genre, but it also defines its genre. For me, a 9 out of 10 is a game that is extremely good and might even be a paragon example of a specific genre, but doesn't define it. Other people won't reference this work. A great example of this for me is actually Far Cry 3. While Far Cry 3 has a lot of elements that aren't particularly unique. It's an open world game. It has fast travel, it has cars, it has guns, it has crafting, a lot of elements that are very well established. The way that that specific game blends all of those things together, it comes together in this kind of perfect package of story, gameplay, open world mechanics, etc., to make a 9 out of 10 experience, a perfect example of the sort of Ubisoft open world. Whereas lots of the other Far Cry games, in my opinion, aren't even close to holding up to Far Cry 3. 8 out of 10s are usually games for me that are experimental and that push forward game design in a very specific way, but not in a way that defines that genre. A great example of an 8 out of 10 for me is actually Bloodborne. Bloodborne was a unique, interesting, and heavily thematic variation on the Dark Souls formula. It was very risky. The combat pacing completely fundamentally changed from Dark Souls 1. And while the game is excellent, Bloodborne did not have the same impact on game design and game culture that Dark Souls 1 has. You don't see people referencing Bloodborne in terms of tone and story and mechanics in the same way that you see people referencing Dark Souls 1. There's a reason that they're called Souls-likes and not Bloodborne-likes. Again, these are really simplified criticisms, okay, guys? Like, these will all probably eventually be their own videos, so give me a break, okay? In the 5 through 7 range, those are games that are still generally positive, but aren't really making any sort of new contributions to the game design space. They're not really pushing any sort of artistic horizons. They're not really contributing much to the overall gaming space. Anything that I would personally rank under a 5 are games that I feel are actively not worth playing to various degrees. A 4 and a 3 are games that I would just find probably boring, not worth your time, or just artistically vapid, meaning they don't really have anything to say, or the things that they say are very old and very tired. A 2, 1, and 0 for me are games that are somehow actively detrimental to the gaming space. I can't even think off the top of my head games that I would rate that low, but these are ratings that I would reserve for games that are so boring, so ridiculous, so artistically worthless that it's not even really worth talking about them. So likely I probably wouldn't even do a review on games like those. Though if there is some really big, amazing AAA game that fits into those categories, I may, eventually have to react to a game in that way. Something else that's really important to me in games criticism is the idea of functionality. A lot of games journalists seem to be really willing to just kind of overlook major performance issues, like having constant crashing, having massive, like really awful frame rates on launch, those sorts of things. Personally, I think one of the things that games journalists can do is they can help hold gaming companies to account for the mistakes that they make. And releasing games in buggy, unfinished, broken fashion has kind of just become the norm now. And I think this is incredibly troubling and disappointing to say that that's kind of the state of where we are in gaming, is that these game companies just feel like they can release these buggy messes and expect us to not only buy them for full retail, but pre-order them for full retail price. Especially since a lot of these things tend to get fixed within the first month. It's very strange to me why there isn't some sort of other mechanism for these games companies to just simply release the games in more stable finished states. So in my reviews, you'll always see me taking into account the state at which the game was at launch into the overall factoring of the game. Now, that was a lot of theory. And I hope that you enjoyed this. Because one of the things that I really want to be on this channel is I want to be really clear with you guys. I want you to understand the biases that I bring to the table, and I want you guys to understand that I don't believe that my opinions are infallible or unable to be incorrect. I'm going to do my best to bring as much information and well thought out arguments and comments to the table in these reviews, and I expect that a lot of you will want to do the same. So if you disagree with me, you are always welcome to jump in the comments and say so. The whole point of games criticism is to engage with the art of video games, and that often requires disagreement between different people. All that I ask really is that you do your best as my audience to see that when I criticize a game, I am not criticizing you or your experiences with those games. If you enjoy the game and you disagree with the reasons that I don't enjoy the game, that you are able to see that that doesn't get rid of your personal enjoyment of the game. But at the end of the day, I'm always more than willing to have discussions about these kinds of things. It's one of the reasons that I run a Discord. It's a really good place to talk about these things. Okay, so that's a bit of my games criticism theory. Check out part 2. It's going to come out in a couple days, talking about my theory of game balance. So we talked a bit about talking about games from a sort of meta perspective. Now, what about games during their life cycle? How do we talk about games being balanced or imbalanced? And I'll go through some of my theory on that as well.